They slapped the coin onto the auction block with a sound so thin it felt like the last breath leaving a sick room, and before the scrape of metal on wood stopped vibrating in my ribs, the crier laughed. The men laughed. Even the dust seemed to laugh. Because a single coin for a whole human is the kind of number that turns a crowd into a mirror, where you can watch your own worth evaporate while your brothers, the boys who once showed you how to skip rocks and once swore they would never let the river take you, stand 2 paces back with their hands in their pockets pretending they are counting blessings and not selling blood. And if you think that is the moment I collapsed, you do not know the precise machinery of survival mood, how it locks your knees and stitches your lungs shut and slides a sheet of ice over your face so no one can see the emotional scars clawing from the inside out. Because I had learned early, in foster kitchens and on cracked sidewalks and in neon diners at 3 a.m., where loneliness drinks coffee and stares at its reflection in a window that only shows streetlights, that you do not bargain with humiliation by giving it tears. You stare it down and save the crying for a place with a door, which is why my letter of truth stayed hidden in my bodice, and folded twice along a lifeline and hot against my skin like a coal that could light the way out if I lived long enough to walk. It is fashionable now to pretend that secrets are solved by proof and not by breath, to act as if redemption is a trick you pull in 60 seconds with a smash cut and a headline. Her brothers sold her for a single coin at auction, to believe that healing is a montage and not a slow, stubborn second chance that looks like a hand held steady when your knees want to fold, and a voice that chooses restraint where spectacle would pay better. But I can tell you with the intimacy of someone who has slept under penthouse empties, where the luxury cars hum below like metal lullabies, and also under roofs that do not know your name, that the unspoken connection that saves you often arrives without music. It arrives as a body stepping between you and a ledger. It arrives as a man who refuses to price you because he prefers to take responsibility, not possession. And before I knew that I wanted such a man to exist, I heard the deliberate thud of a horse stepping sideways, the scrape of a boot toe testing the plank, and a shadow entered the circle that did not belong to any buyer there. He did not perform a hero's entrance. He did not fling a dramatic cloak. He did not even look at me first, because the kind of trust that lasts is quiet at the beginning. It reads the room and reads your breath and reads the way your brothers look away as if sight were a sin. And when I finally let my eyes take him in, I saw ash-dark hair tied back without ornaments to catch on. Scrub, a scar along the horse's shoulder where a saddle once bit too long into work, a lariat worn to a softened braid by real labor and not parade, and a face that had learned emotional distance not because he liked hiding but because he understood crowds and danger and how quickly vulnerability can get priced. And someone to my left said Navajo, the way men say labels when they are sharpening them into knives. But in the years that followed I would use his own word, Diné, and I would say it privately, because the love that defies fairy tale tropes begins with respect. And respect begins with listening, and listening begins with a silence presence that allows someone else to breathe without being turned into evidence. The auction crier swung his ledger like a small god and asked for bids that were not jokes, his grin slicing at me like a thin blade. And my brothers kept studying the packed dirt the way boys study their boots when they decide. Abandonment recognition is easier if you pretend you didn't do it on purpose. And when the man stepped between the ledger and my body, he did not. I've unhook his knife. He did not draw a bow. He set one brown palm flat on the saddle that had carried him across a day's worth of glare and said, "Not here," in a voice that moved like water through gravel, which is a sentence you cannot spend. And yet it bought me the only commodity I needed to make it to the next breath. And the crier said, "If there is no number, then there is no bid." And the crowd barked approval because numbers make cowards feel like men. And that was the minute my survival instinct misfired and tried to save me with anger, because I wanted to shout that a single coin could not buy my forgiveness. I wanted to name the bruised pasts in public and make them pay, but the man's hand hovered above the saddle horn, like a blessing that belonged to no church. And I remembered that resilience sometimes looks like swallowing the right words so you can spit them later when they will do more than scatter. If you are waiting for me to tell you that a cavalry arrived or a judge found a conscience, then you are still living in the version of justice that gets applause. Because what happened next was weirder and better and stranger and more viral in its own quiet way. The kind of what the fuck moment that breaks the first minute of a video because no one expects a man to break his own means of moving so that a woman he has not met can move at all. And when he slid a knife from its sheath, the crowd leaned in with the hunger of children who want a spectacle, and of men who never learned the work that keeps women alive. And he used that blade to cut the cinch clean. He used that blade to take the saddle apart, strip by strip until the status of it lay in leather ribbons across the dust, and with each cut he dismantled a version of himself that would have been faster and safer and lonelier. He made barter from status, sling from ornament, bandage from pride, and when he lifted a strip and tied it around my raw wrist, I felt something like a clinic of a second chance open in my chest where the old wound lived. Because he didn't say this leather means you belong to me. He said this knot means you won't drop yourself when the ground tips. In the space where a buyer would normally list terms, he set boundaries instead. He said no one touches her without her consent, and no one turns this into a story they tell at supper to make themselves feel brave. And no one prices breath at a laugh again, or we will return without asking for the stage. And you might say that sounds like a speech, but it wasn't. It was a new grammar written in strips of saddle, and the way he stood half a step to the side so I could still see daylight while still using his body to offset the first kick of a panic that wanted to fold me in half. And I had to decide faster than shame likes to move whether I would let a stranger become a door. Because the difference between possession and stewardship is not visible to a crowd until the one being saved says it out loud. So I said yes with my spine, and kept my mouth closed with a dignity. I refused to let hunger take, and that yes turned the air around us from stale to oxygen, which is a fancy way of saying I could breathe again. The crier did not love losing control, and my brothers, who had used survival as a courtroom where they declared me guilty of needing, shifted like a team that suddenly can't find the playbook they stole from a better school. And somewhere behind me a hammer cocked with the kind of click that writes its own ending if no one interrupts it, and the man's horse slid one step between me and the noise like it had been trained by grief instead of reins. And he kept cutting the saddle even though steel had entered the conversation, and he said softly to me and possibly to his own scars that a second chance is not something you win. It is something you hold until it stops shaking. And if you are counting the SEO keywords on your fingers, I will save you time because this is what they look like when they are, not captions. Vulnerability is letting a stranger tie a promise to your wrist. Trust is believing he means the promise and not the optics. Loneliness is hearing a whole town laugh while you are priced and choosing to live anyway. Healing is what happens between the cut and the next breath. Redemption is slower than anger and lasts longer. Resilience is a choice you repeat until your muscles memorize it. Emotional intimacy is the distance between his hand and my face when he could have gripped my chin and didn't. And the unspoken connection is the fact that I could feel his pulse in the air though he didn't touch me at all. If I say that in the days before this I had stood under streetlights counting to 30 before entering apartments where no one waited. If I say that I have known the emptiness that looks like money and the apartments high enough to make you feel superior while making you feel small. If I say that the first time I ever saw forgiveness, it was in a mirror where I had written forgive in dry soap and left it so long it turned into a ghost. Then you will understand why I had not trained for the particular shock of a man breaking a saddle for a woman the ledger had reduced to a coin, and why my first thought was not romance but logistics, because personal growth is what happens when you rewire your reflexes while danger is licking your ankles. And while he looped the first strip and then the second around my forearms in a makeshift sling strong enough to carry shame without tearing skin, I looked for my brothers and found only their absence, which is another kind of betrayal. And I told myself out loud in a voice low enough that only my letter of truth could hear it, that love, which defies fairy tale tropes, rarely arrives with roses and a choreographed apology. It arrives with sweat and sacrifice, and a refusal to turn your pain into theater. The men closest to the block wanted blood because blood is the easiest plot point to understand, and there is a kind of loneliness that makes even good men mean. A loneliness like penthouse empties. A loneliness like boys who watched their father's debts multiply and decided cruelty was cheaper than courage. And though I did not forgive them, then I took a note from the clinics where women sit in chairs and learn how to breathe again without apologizing for it. And I used that breath to widen my frame so the world would fit inside it without collapsing me. And by the time I had my feet under me and the sling under my shoulder and the man had knotted the last strip to the last ring and the horse had decided it would follow the next instruction that sounded like respect, the crier had found his anger and the crowd had found their noise, and the number of outcomes where I lived had begun to shrink like a puddle at noon. If you are still with me after these first 60 seconds, if the shock of a single coin as a price tag has done its ugly work in your chest, if the mystery of why a Diné hunter would break his own saddle in a yard full of men who would mock him for it is pulling on your sleeve, then you will understand that the only cliffhanger I can give you that is worth the calories you will spend to climb it is not a question about whether the bullet will fly or whether the sheriff will find his better self. It is the question that rips me open even now when the lights are off and the day is too quiet, which is whether my brothers who sold me for one coin will ever learn the grammar of responsibility the way this stranger did in a minute, and whether the sound that came next, the click of a safety or the drop of a hammer or the hiss of someone inhaling their first honest breath, would decide if I got to test that question with a future at all. Because as he leaned toward the horse and said, "Now," and as my boot found the stirrup, and as the crowd surged forward as if pushed by the same old wind that always pushes men toward cowardice, I felt the world tilt, and in that tilt a line broke, and I am asking you to stay long enough to see which line it was. The moment his blade kissed the cinch, and the saddle's first strip tore loose like a ribbon ripped off a bad promise, the yard forgot how to breathe in unison, and I felt the crowd's appetite tilt, from entertainment to anger, because a Diné hunter who breaks his own saddle in front of men who trade in other people's breath is not performing poverty or bravado. He is publishing a boundary in a language the ledger cannot speak, and although the crier barked that a bid requires a number and a woman without a number remains for sale, the man simply placed his palm on the warm, sweating curve of his horse's neck, and said again, "Not here," with a patience that did not try to convince anyone who loved the sound of a single coin slapping wood, and I recognized, with the cold clarity that arrives after humiliation has scorched every sentimental fantasy from the air, that what he offered me was not purchase but refuge, not rescue as spectacle but responsibility as practice, a refusal to price me in public because he intended to carry the price in private, tied to his own body where men cannot weigh it and laugh. It is difficult to explain to anyone who has never been traded how a quiet sentence can feel larger than a verdict, how "not here" can loosen the spine you braced for a rope, how the simple act of stepping between my skin and the ledger performed an intimacy that did not touch me at all. An intimacy I had begged mirrors for in penthouse empties, when the luxury cars sang under my window like mechanical crickets, and loneliness threw false halos around my shoulders, an intimacy I had mimed in neon diners where I stirred coffee and watched couples practice forgiveness without ever saying the word, an intimacy I never trusted because abandonment recognition calcifies around your ribs until even the good kinds of closeness feel like a trap. And yet when he sliced a second strip from the saddle tree and threaded it through the first, when he tested the give with a tug learned from years of tying more urgent loads, I felt the letter of truth in my bodice heat like a coal again, and I understood that this was what second chance looks like. If you strip it of fairy tale costumes, it looks like leather turned to a sling, and pride turned to rope burns on the palms of a man who would rather break something that carries him than let a crowd carry me into a story I did not choose. My brothers flinched when the knife flashed, because guilt is always sure it is the target, even when the blade is busy cutting a man's own property into kindness, and the shorter one, whose jaw still carried the shadow of the boy who once taught me to whistle, said something that tried to sound like authority and failed, while the older one counted the faces around us with the speed of a gambler, measuring how much protection a mob can be coaxed into providing for free if you appeal to its appetite. And perhaps I should say here that the title of this whole mess, "Her brothers sold her for a single coin at auction," does not mean I have convinced myself that they were born monsters, because that lie would be too easy. It means that when pressed by hunger, fear, and a town that rewards cruelty with reputation, they made a choice. And while forgiveness might one day find them in a clinic of a second chance, where someone teaches them how to speak without hiding behind performance, today was not that day, and the only redemption I could afford was survival. And survival in that yard required a man who refused to turn my body into proof. He pulled the billet strap free, threw the saddle to the dirt where it looked like a dead animal shedding its skin, and from the torn leather he shaped a harness with a competence that made me want to cry for reasons that made no sense to anyone who has never tasted emotional intimacy in the way a knot is tied. He looped one band across my shoulders and another under the swell of my ribs and tested their balance with a brief, respectful pressure that never lingered, because trust earned over time begins by refusing to take what crisis tries to justify. And then he stepped past me with the smallest bow of the head, a gesture so untheatrical it might have been a myth falling from a horse, and he set the remaining good leather on the block in front of the crier the way a man lays a tool on a table to barter for a repair, and in a voice that did not tremble he said that if the ledger required an entry to unwind an entry, then let the saddle stand in the column where my name had been scratched, let the tally read leather for life, not money for a woman. And if they wished to laugh at the arithmetic they could, because arithmetic that saves a person is never elegant enough for men who memorize prices as a way to avoid remembering names. The crier bristled, because clerks who imagine themselves kings cannot endure a story that disobeys their ink, and the buyer who had tossed the single coin as if skipping me across water until I sank, tugged at his vest and called me ungrateful in the dialect men reserve for mouths that do not thank their own erasure, and my brothers tried to slither into the comfort of the crowd's back row, while the man who was not bidding reached into the belly of the broken saddle and eased out one last strip of smooth leather he had saved for this precise moment, and in a move that would have played as showmanship in a different story, and here played as competence, he tied that strip around my wrist, the way climbers tie into each other when the cliff turns deceitful. He tied it in a knot that would tighten under strain and yet never cut blood. He tied it like a sentence that would hold under friction, and while he tied, he spoke in the low register. I learned later he keeps for grief and animals and children waking from nightmares. He said, "You won't drop yourself." And that was the first sentence a man had said to me in months that did not require me to shrink to fit inside it. The buyer wanted to perform rage because rage looks good on men who are used to getting their way. The sheriff wanted to perform order because order looks good on men who have learned to keep their hands clean while others do the dirty work. The crowd wanted to perform appetite because appetite looks righteous when you name it tradition. And my brothers wanted to perform distance because distance plays as innocence when a woman is being priced. And through the middle of that stage, the Diné hunter walked in a straight line to the sheriff and said a handful of words that forced air back into lungs that had given it to noise. He said that the law does not require a number if no sale occurs, that a man can void a mark by paying the cost of nullifying it, and that he was paying that cost in leather and in labor by promising to remove me from this yard without letting me come to harm or letting them come to harm in the doing, and that if the sheriff needed paperwork, he would write it on his own back with the dust as witness, because sometimes paper makes cowards brave, and he preferred the kind of record that is written in how a day ends, not how a ledger looks. If you are listening for the Navajo hunter keyword because search demands it, understand this. The only reason that phrase belongs in a sentence with me is because the line, "not here," had a body to stand in, and because the choice to break a saddle for a stranger is the kind of ethics that makes families survive long enough to become families at all. Not because I needed a romantic trope or a myth with cheekbones. And though later I would learn the word Diné and fold it into my mouth the way you learn to say a friend's name without nicking it on your old teeth, today the only word that mattered was boundary, and he kept raising it with the soft strength of someone who does not confuse gentleness with weakness, who knows that healing is not the absence of injury but the refusal to pass it on. I do not know exactly how the next minute looked to the men who stood there calculating their lunch, but I know how it felt to me. It felt like those nights when the elevator doors open onto a hallway that mirrors back your face and your life and your loneliness, and you can choose to walk inside a room where no one waits or turn around and walk back to the clinic of a second chance where someone may forget your name but will remember your breath. It felt like the missed connections I wrote on cocktail napkins and never called, because love that defies fairy tale tropes requires a courage I did not have. It felt like a cracked sidewalk, where I had waited for a ride that did not come, and finally learned that walking is also a ride. It felt like a mirror that does not ask you to pose. And then the horse shifted and he slid the improvised sling under my weight and my muscles argued and my letter of truth burned, and the buyer reached to seize my arm with fingers that had never learned the difference between grabbing and holding. And the hunter did something so simple it read as shocking. He turned his shoulder into the man's hand with a pivot that placed bone where flesh had been. He made the grip lose its target by offering himself as the edge. And then he said to me in a voice I would one day trust without swallowing, "Walk." We walked, which is a word too small for leaving a yard where men tell jokes about single coins and the price of women. We walked past the crate stamped with a brand that had no jurisdiction over breath. We walked past the windless flag and the board where numbers make a story sound official. We walked until the board's chalk dust was behind us, and the sheriff had to decide if his badge was a costume or a craft. And at the far gate, a boy no older than I was when I learned to tie my own shoes under a foster mother's scold, looked at me the way a person looks at a stray dog who may bite the child and may become the child's best friend. And I wanted to tell him that both things are true, that everyone you meet after a yard like this one lives partly in their teeth and partly in their hands, and that the quiet transformations you will not see are the ones that will keep you alive. The sheriff shouted something about banishment, which is what men offer when they cannot admit their system asked for more blood than they can lick off their fingers, and the buyer spat the word thief because it helps to call someone a crime when what you actually mean is a refusal. And my brothers said nothing because distance is a language you can speak forever once you start. And through it all, the hunter did the one thing no one knows how to do when a camera is pointed at them. He remained uninteresting to spectacle. He remained the man who tied a promise to my wrist, and refused to demand that I pay him for it with gratitude or performance. He remained the opposite of those men in diners whose eyes drink you like whiskey, and then ask why your heart does not stay warm for them after they leave. He remained steady, which is the first law of love that isn't trying to put you to sleep so it can steal your wallet. He remained a person you could build a slow bond with without calling it love before it learned how to be love. I wish I could say that in that instant the sheriff changed his mind and my brothers changed their faces and the buyer changed his habits. But change is not a trick. It is work, and work needs time, and time needs breath, and breath needs you to live through the minute you are in. And the minute we were in ended not with an escape worthy of a song, but with a sound that was all metal and intention. A sound that sits in the throat of any yard that pretends it is a courthouse. The clean mechanical click that makes every decision you have made either turn to smoke or harden into bone. It came from somewhere behind, my left shoulder, where performance gathers when decency runs thin. It announced itself like a headline designed to make the algorithm giddy, and because I have learned to read the difference between attention and danger, I did not turn toward it. I watched the hunter's eyes instead, and in them I saw the same choice he had made when he cut his saddle, the choice to pay without purchasing, to move without running, to absorb the first harm so the second never arrives. And as the world squeezed down to the size of a trigger and a breath, I understood the cliff we were walking toward was not whether a bullet would fly. It was whether the story would become the kind of story that ends with a body, and whether I would let that be my ending, or would learn the courage to live the longer, harder variant, the one where the first words a man spoke to me in months, not here, had to be spoken again with a different grammar. Not now, not like this, not at the cost the crowd is willing to pay. He drew the knife again, not to threaten a soul in that yard, but to rework the mathematics of the day, and when the blade slid beneath the cracked latigo and the first clean strip of leather peeled away with a sigh, I felt the old arithmetic I had learned in diners and foster kitchens and penthouse empties where worth is measured in. Compliance and quiet begin to fail, because here was a Diné hunter turning status into safety in front of men who worship ledgers. Here was a man confessing with his hands that mobility can be sacrificed for mercy, that resilience is a practice you can tie, that redemption is not a speech but a sling made out of what used to carry you faster than your conscience. And as he fed the strip through the D-ring and tested the give with a tug that spoke of miles and weather more faithfully than any sermon, I watched the saddle collapse from icon to inventory, while something in me rose from inventory to person. He worked without hurry and without show, cutting the fender into 2 long lashings, splitting the skirt along a seam that would later lie flat against my ribs, freeing the billets to braid a bandage you could trust. And as he worked, I fought the reflex that has saved me and scarred me in equal measure, the reflex that hears help as a trap and intimacy as a tax, that reflex born of abandonment, recognition, and polished by emotional distance until the mirror answers every question with your own face. And I said aloud, quiet enough to keep it from becoming spectacle, and clear enough to make it binding, that I would accept help on my terms, which are consent and witness and dignity kept intact while my body is repositioned into a future. And he answered without looking at me the way men answer when they have nothing to sell and everything to lose, saying, "Then keep breathing and keep telling me what hurts." And it startled me to realize he meant more than flesh. He meant the hidden pain that hoards its own breath like contraband and only loosens when trust stands nearby without making a speech. The crier scowled as if care were counterfeit. The buyer rolled his coin along his knuckles as if worth were a trick only his fingers knew. My brothers stared at the boards as if splinters could absolve them, and in that choir of practiced cowardice, the hunter walked to the block with the best panel of skirt, leather cradled like a book, laid it flat with the grain side up, and told the ledger man in a voice that carried further than anger that labor is the only legal tender he recognized today, that this leather had been earned over years of wind and sun and miles, and would now purchase the erasure of a line that should never have been written. And when the crier scoffed about numbers and precedent, and the proper column for a woman's breath, the hunter bent his head, not in submission, but to focus, and put ink to paper with his own name and a spare sentence that would outlive the yard's memory of our faces. A sentence that said simply that the mark beside my name was voided for cause being the choosing of responsibility over price. When he returned, he carried not triumph but attention. He set the new lashings across my shoulders and under my arms and tightened them to that precise firmness that does not bruise. He looped a broad strap low so the weight spreads. He checked my hands and asked if I could feel each finger and waited for my nod. And then he fashioned a narrow length from the last clean billet and tied it around my wrist with the kind of knot that tightens under panic but loosens under breath. And as the loop snugged my pulse, he said softly, not to claim me but to anchor me, "You won't drop yourself." A vow that reached deeper than tendon and bone into the small part of me that has closed every door a second before love could enter. That small part soothed not by romance but by competence, by a quiet assurance that my survival would not be purchased with humiliation today. The coin flashed, and my chest pinched because symbols have teeth when they reflect your history back at you. The saddle, once a silhouette of freedom, now lay in bright strips, like a ledger turned into rope for climbing instead of binding, and I knew I would never again hear the jingle of tack without thinking of how a life can be reclaimed by act, not price, how healing is less miracle than method repeated under stress, how forgiveness might one day become possible if I kept walking without rehearsing fury for an audience that only ever tips well for spectacle. And as the hunter gathered the loose ends, he asked me for the letter I keep against my ribs, not to read it, but to honor that it existed. And I told him the truth it holds about bread taken and lies told and nights without heat. And he nodded once with the gravity of someone who has been inside winter long enough to stop judging other people for how they try to build a fire. Then the yard remembered it could bite. And the bite announced itself with that clean metallic syllable every hunted person knows by heart. The click that says someone's profit depends on your pain and would prefer the lesson to be taught in blood. I felt the crowd's appetite sharpen in the same breath my brothers tried to fade their outlines into the many, and the buyer's smile thinned into that blade men wear when the story threatens to escape them. And the hunter did not flinch because he has practiced the choreography of refusal longer than the shooter has practiced aim. He slid his body half a step between me and the noise, not trapping me behind him but aligning our spines so that we moved as a choice rather than as a target. And in that alignment I recognized the strange, slow bond of unspoken connection, the way a stranger's steadiness can teach your scattered nerves a new rhythm faster than any speech about resilience ever could. Dust lifted around our ankles as if the ground were instructing us to disappear. Hands reach for the broken tack because men who cannot lift responsibility will always lift souvenirs. The crier started saying words like theft and disruption and order as if he had invented them. And the sheriff's gaze narrowed into the small window cowards call authority. And through that dim window the hunter looked at me the way a field medic looks at a patient deciding whether to stand, and when he judged that my knees would answer if asked, he tipped his head toward the alley between the sugar barrels and the corral posts, where shade and the possibility of a second chance lived. And his whisper threaded my ear not like a command but like a door finally oiled after years of sticking. "Move now," he said, and I moved into the dust and the heat and the work, while behind us the yard fought over the leather, the way men fight over a story that refuses to leave them heroic. We left the yard the way people leave a bad sermon, no applause and no names, our backs tasting the heat before our percent faces did. The road pitching into a mirage-wide afternoon that made even certainty look elastic. And as the alkali glare lifted its quiet cruelty to eye level, and the brittle shrubs wrote their short biographies in thorn and shadow, I learned the first rule the city never taught me, that breath is currency in country like this, and the only bank that matters is the one under your ribs. So each inhale had to be earned by the pace of my feet and the angles of my shoulders and the way I let the sling carry what shame would rather drag. And each exhale had to be released slowly enough to keep panic from spending everything at once like a gambler who thinks the next hand will finally make him clean. He set a rhythm that did not flirt with collapse, a 4-count that matched the horse's shortened stride and my smaller reach. And he taught without mystifying the lessons men love to paint in thunder so no one else can claim them. He pointed at grit. He called wind teeth, where the sand stacked in a particular scallop that told us which seam of shade would last to noon. He lifted his chin toward the sweep of a hawk and asked me what the shadow circled water, if the circle held steady, death if it jittered and drew others, and lunch if it dropped sharp and rose sharper, and together we read hoof story, where a print's depth said driven or fresh, and the smear on the toe said downhill or panic, and instead of subtracting me from his competence, he added me, correcting my wild guesses with a simplicity that made me want to keep trying rather than to hide, which is a kind of emotional intimacy I have rarely been offered when stakes were this high. I had promised that the letter folded warm against my skin would govern my mouth, so I spoke its truth in the plain voice new trust demands, telling him in full sentences how long hunger had been stalking my house, how I took bread when the cupboard turned sermon and the church turned schedule, how I lied to shield a child whose sleep weighed less than a loaf because shame bends honor in ways that keep breath moving. And I chose breath, how abandonment recognition hums like a generator behind every decision I have made since the night a door shut and did not open until my knuckles bled, and he did not clear his throat or offer absolution or ask for more detail to sharpen the entertainment value. He let my words stand where they landed and said only that he understood the arithmetic of winter, and that a midwife once pulled his sister back from the mouth of a fever, with hands that knew how to count in breath instead of minutes, and that debts travel forward, not backward, which is why he had stopped in a yard that wanted proof he refused to sell. We changed gait the way you change conversation when a child falls asleep in the next room, softer and less interesting to strangers, a drift that confused sign by smudging the narrative. And silence soon re-educated my nerves, the way clinics of a second chance re-educate your lungs, because silence in towns is a weapon used to isolate you, and in deserts, it is shelter used to conserve you. And inside that shelter my survival mood loosened its chokehold until trust could find cartilage to grip, and I realized that loneliness has been the cheapest leadership in my life. The kind that marches me into disasters and calls them romances, while this new thing, the slow bond that does not demand a name before it starts doing its work, was guiding me with fewer words than any lover has ever used to confuse me. The horizon kept shivering and the road kept uncoiling toward heat that did not care who I thought I was, and the horse breathed with a noise that made me grateful and afraid at once. Because resilience in animals is a kind of forgiveness that shames people who ask for too much and tip too little, and just as I began to believe, our narrow channel through the day might carry us to evening intact. The air stiffened with the news my body knows before my ears do, hoofbeats gathering in a pattern that meant counting, not wandering, a math that says pursuit and distance and how long until the next decision. And I felt the old city version of myself reach for speed and rage and a can opener for fate. But the hunter lifted his palm with a patience that shifted me back into the method that has already saved me twice. Pause. Read, adjust, repeat. He veered us into ground that looked like a careless spill of night left behind by a giant basalt tongues lolling out of the sand with seams like stitches holding the earth together. And he placed my feet where the hard plates nested so my steps would not sing. And to distract my dread, he offered me small work that felt like dignity, testing the sling knots I had sewn from saddle scraps, showing me how to roll my tongue into the hollow that tricks saliva into arriving when water refuses, teaching me to ride the breath like a reluctant horse belly first, ribs later, chest last so fear does not scrape me hollow. And he did it all without mystical theater, because livelihood, not legend, lives out here. And while we moved, he told me the smallest fact that would carry me another mile. That shade moves like a clock even when the sun swears it is standing still, and that if we want noon to feel like mercy, we must arrive at the right rock when the world pretends to hold its breath. We reached the dark mouth of a basalt throat exactly as the light decided it preferred someone else, and not us, and he guided me down into the cool, the way a nurse guides a stubborn patient into bed, making it feel like my idea, until I thanked myself, and the horse tucked itself behind the jut of stone with a sigh that sounded like a badly told secret finally corrected. And for one quiet minute I believed the cinematic lie that safety arrives with a swell of music, and then stays for the length of a song. But then the pebbles above us skittered in a pattern I have since learned to hate, a stuttering roll followed by the mean little patter that says wait, not wind, and the boot scraped the ledge with the practiced indifference of a man who thinks gravity will lay stories down at his feet if he just pretends he owns the cliff, and I flattened my breath into the sling and felt the knot at my wrist remind me of the promise I made at noon, and I waited for the moment when the world would decide if it believed my vow. Winter did not arrive with snow so much as with a cupboard that learned to close on air, a hollow clap I still hear in my ribs. The trader's tally crept like frost along a window, and my brother's boys, who once patched my shoes and swore bad seasons were still only seasons, began to wear fear like a borrowed badge. They spoke in the clipped authority of men who hope volume can pass for law. I will not recast them as monsters, because I remember the doorway they once filled to keep a drunk from stumbling through, and the way their hands shook when the burial bill came due. But I will not absolve them either. Fear dressed as authority still chooses, and they chose the cheaper tool. Rather than build a bridge that would have cost time, apology, and pride, they turned our blood into a coin-shaped solution and steered me toward a yard where worth could be erased and laughed at. The tracker, quiet as good weather, listened to my defense about drought and debt until it ran out of breath. Then he cut the argument clean with a gentleness that left no bruise. They sold the risk, too. I heard what I had refused to name, that it is one thing to sell a debt and another to sell the fall that follows it, expecting my body to cushion their landing. The buyer's coin, slapped down like a small moon around which every shame tried to orbit, became a reckoning object I could neither ignore nor spend. Would I keep it as witness, toss it into sand, or hide it inside the letter pressed against my heart? Each choice imagined a different shape for forgiveness. None of them belonged to this hour. We were already wedged into the basalt slot, my shoulders pressed into a posture that felt like prayer and defiance at once. I inventoried what I could afford to lose and what I could not. I would surrender the version of pride that refuses water because the cup is offered poorly. I would surrender the habit of apologizing to men whose harm arrives wearing family faces. But I would not surrender my name to a ledger, nor my right to narrate this day, nor the small hot coal of mercy I kept for myself. The tracker had tied a narrow strap from his leather to my wrist, a promise I would not drop myself when panic came hunting. The yard's appetite announced itself with a clean metallic syllable. A shot cracked. spitting dust so fine it salted my tongue. Rage rose a fast, expensive animal until his palm settled on my shoulder and then my mouth, not as punishment, only as calibration. Breath slowed against his skin. The knot at my wrist tightened the way good vows do when weather shifts. Above us the shadow thickened, a boot scuffed stone with the bored confidence of a man certain gravity is on his side. Grit clung to my gums. The coin burned in my pocket like a cold star. Somewhere beyond the geometry of rock, my brothers tried to pass for strangers in their own story. I wanted to name them aloud and salt the yard with syllables they could never wash away. But breath is the only currency that spends in country like this, and I needed mine. The boot landed in shadow. His palm sealed my lips. We became smaller than sound and larger than fear, and for a span of heartbeats the world seemed to forget we existed. The rider's weight shifts over the throat of stone. A second boot searches for purchase. My lungs tally seconds I cannot afford to exhale. He rescued me with a pause. Not a lunge. Not a blow, one pebble tipped sideways by the curl of his knuckle so it whispered into an already scuffed fan. A sound a practiced ear would mistake for wind finishing what it started. Then nothing. That deliberate nothing taught the danger above us. There was no arithmetic to solve here today. My body shook in spite of discipline. Shaking felt like betrayal until I remembered that tremor is proof of life, not a confession of weakness. I refused to apologize inside my skull to the version of me that wants to be impressive in crisis. I matched the tremor to his slow-breathed metronome and let it pass through. Leather brushed my ribs as he eased the canteen into the sling's inner pocket. He turned his face away while I drank, granting privacy as method, not courtesy. Water touched my tongue like a second chance that knows it has to court you before you'll believe it. When the rider's bored curse slid down the wall like a dropped coin, the tracker asked my name not to collect it for a story, but to offer me the chance to choose which name would survive the day. The yard sticker, or the one written in my letter of truth. I said the name that holds the bridge and not the weapon. His nod fixed it to the road ahead. The sling had crept out of place while fear carved angles into me. With the back of his wrist he lifted my elbow, shook out the strap, reset the low band so weight rode my hips instead of my chest, and checked circulation with 2 fingers at my wrist where the promise knot lived. No flourish. Only competence. Movement resumed in the registered speed of survival. Deliberate, quiet, built from choices that do not demand applause. We climbed the basalt staircase his hands found for us, toes testing seams that would not sing. Above the flats, a dust devil stitched itself from glare and impatience, capering in the open like a stray dog that might still bite. Its brief grammar tugged 2 lines of sign toward each other until they read like edges of a closing mouth. He did not dramatize the news. His face grew ordinary, the opposite of panic. "We'll need trade," he said, weighing what leather remained, weighing also my keepsakes and the stubborn habits I might offer instead. Trade was not threat. It was invitation into a math that keeps people alive. We angled toward a dull rectangle of a post crouched on the horizon. He taught while we moved, short lessons that turned mystery into method. Wind teeth to choose the cooler seam. Bird shadow to read the sky's opinion. Hoof story to tell driven from fresh. Silence sheltered us the way walls do in clinics where people relearn breath. I kept pace with the 4 count that matched the horse's shortened stride and my smaller reach. And when doubt tried to speed me into mistakes, the knot at my wrist tightened like a sentence designed to hold under friction. At the lip of a shallow wash, the dust devil unraveled. What it left behind was worse than omen. 2 converging tracks, one heavy and urgent, one careful and patient, the kind that arrive together because the story ahead is worth more to them than water. Time thinned. He pressed the last intact strip of leather into my palm like a ticket and pointed his chin at the post, a gesture that translated easily. Change the math before the math changes you. Heat rings lift from the roof of the post. A mirror flash blinks glass or scope, and our shadows lengthen in the open as the tracks draw closer. The post hunkered in the heat like a scab the desert had decided not to pick. 4 walls, the color of old flour, a roof that threw back the sun in dull tin pulses. Inside, gun oil, sweat, and the tired perfume of salt sacks stacked like small white tombs. Needles winked from a glass. Thread hung in loops. Beans slept in barrels that had learned patience, and behind the counter stood a man whose pupils were ledgers, tallies. Where eyes should be, his mouth arranged into the neutrality clerks. Where the way undertakers wear sympathy, professional, rentable, not to be confused with care. He looked me over the way drought looks over a field. The room waited to see whether I would become a discount. I stepped to the counter before the hunter could absorb the first insult for me, and I said my price out loud in first person so the walls would learn it with the clerk. I will trade leather, ring band, and the story of labor. I will not trade my body, my name, or any coordinates that let men hunt me better. The clerk's smile did that small sideways thing arithmetic does when it thinks it has found a loophole. He touched the leather the hunter laid down, skirt panels cut clean, billets braided. The spine of a saddle turned into a future, and weighed them with his fingertips as if obligation could be guessed like grain. The hunter added the unboastful list of miles the leather had lived. Winter crossings, foal seasons, river fords. Labor, not pity. The arithmetic shifted. My brothers had sold the risk. I would not sell the remainder. I slid my ring band, thin as a bruise, from the finger my hunger had already thinned, and placed it beside the leather without letting my voice break into apology. This pays for blankets and thread, I said, and a water skin that will not split like a promise. The clerk made a small theater of neutrality, shoulders, sigh. A ledger leaf turned as if the numbers might hiss a warning, but when he named the total, I did not flinch or look at the hunter to rescue me from humiliation. I counted out the arithmetic of what I had left, which was pride trimmed to fit usefulness, and a vow not to rehearse shame for men who prize it. We left with less gear and more future. 2 wool blankets the color of rain that doesn't arrive, a roll of good thread, a kit of needles nested like quiet birds, a water skin whose seams met like an oath, a fistful of dried meat, 1 tin cup, and the clerk's muttered weather report disguised as gossip. Riders had split the valley, one flank heavy and impatient, one careful and patient, the chase no longer heat but strategy. The hunter tucked the information into his spine like a map. I tucked the tin cup against my heart like a promise I could keep with my hands. At the shelf by the door, a child's toy waited. A small horse from scrap wood, ears uneven, tail cut from a rope's fray. It wasn't much of anything unless you had ever needed everything. My palm hovered above it and then withdrew. Hunger to make tomorrow gentler is a good sign, the elder in my head would say. But promises made in shops break easy. I paid for a length of ribbon instead, cheap, stubborn blue, and knotted it around the mouth of the water skin where my son's hand would one day find it. I have not met the tomorrow that will hand him that cup, but I have met the woman who will carry it until the day arrives. I practiced refusing humiliation while paying. The clerk tested me with questions posed as courtesy. Was I traveling under protection? Was I certain about the ring? Had I considered work in the town to the east, where women were said to be treated proper? I answered without flint or flattery. Protected enough. Certain enough. Proper is a word men invented when they wanted to sell women a safer version of danger. His pencil stopped breathing. The hunter's mouth didn't move, but the air around him approved. We stepped into light that had been sharpening knives all afternoon. The wind wrote a single sentence across the dust and then took it back. The hunter knelt and wiped the crust from a print with his palm, reading the story the clerk's gossip had not told. 2 flanks, he said, a diagnosis, not a boast. Heavy and urgent from the south, men who would tire their horses to arrive fast and loud. Careful and patient from the west, men who would read what we erased and arrive exactly when the sun placed our backs in its sight line. The arithmetic of running had changed. We had to change with it. He handed me the folded blankets and kept the water skin high where heat would not steal it blind. Less gear, he said. More future. I repeated it in my head the way you repeat a new prayer until it agrees to live there. I retied the strap at my wrist, the knot dropping myself not, and tested my breath for currency. The post door creaked like a throat clearing before it says something unhelpful. I did not look back to see whether the clerk was watching our figures add up to something he could not sell. The hunter lifted his chin toward the line where the valley split into hard choices. We'll make them spend, he said. I believed him because he had paid all day without asking me to. As we moved off, the toy horse in the window tilted in a draft as if it wanted to run. I felt the ache of a child I could not yet promise, and the promise of a child I refused to let this land take. 50 paces from the post, dust lifted in twin veils from opposite horizons. He squinted, thumbed grit from a second print, and said it a different way that made my lungs go small. 2 flanks closing. We laid the map the only way we could on the backs of our hands and the bottoms of our boots. Wells were not dots. They were rumors stitched to windmills. Arroyos were not lines. They were ribs the land shows when it is hungry. Monsoon scars were not warnings. They were promises delivered late. He measured the afternoon into rest cycles before collapse. 500 paces walking, 50 paces still, 4 slow breaths in, 6 out. Drink when the tongue forgets how to spell your name, not when panic suggests it. Sip air, he told me, and showed me how to put the tip of my tongue in the cave behind my teeth where breath condenses into patience. Survival sounds like mysticism to people who haven't needed it. Out here it's just grammar. The slow bond had learned to walk. When my knot went stubborn, he corrected it with humor rather than heat. You tied this like a judge ties a lie. And my hands, scolded by better men for less, found themselves willing to learn. I cut saddle strips into cleaner lengths and stitched the sling without drawing blood. My needle-tracking rhythms I did not have to drag out of pain. Resilience is repetition, I said aloud to hear whether I believed it. Yes, he answered, and mercy for when you miss. I felt the oldest room in me, where abandonment recognition throws chairs quiet enough to hear the wind explain why it never argues with rock. It just returns. Near dusk a cry reached us across the flats. Not a coyote, not a hawk. Something human-shaped, stretched thin by distance. We stopped with the same foot, the same tilt of head. A practiced coincidence. Ethics inside danger is another kind of water law. He asked, bait or truth, and did not answer his own question. I tasted the creak in panther words I had used in other lives' clinics of a second chance. The vows that keep me from selling what is not mine, and weighed them against the arithmetic of 2 flanks. If we go, I said, we bring them out. No bargaining for proof, no filming, no debts. He nodded. And we don't shoot our shadows, he added. The frontier's way to say we do not injure who we came to save. We angled toward the sound but refused to hurry where the ground liked to lie. The sky built a theology I could trust. Thunderheads climbing out of blue like muscled forgiveness. They promised cover and threat in one body, a mercy that arrives with teeth. He pointed to the anvil's edge and taught the clock of distance count heartbeats between flash and report until knowing becomes less superstition than tool. Water remembers, he said, and it tests to see if you learned anything since last time. He showed me where to stand when the arroyo mutters, where to stand when it screams, and when to stop standing at all. We cut the day into usable pieces. Walk, listen, fix the sling, listen, laugh once on purpose to remind the body it has more than one gear. He told me what the midwife had said when his sister's fever broke, that healing is quiet until it isn't, and your job is to keep the room ready. I told him what the city had taught me about loneliness, that it sells you mirrors and asks you to forgive them when they break. We traded what we could afford. He gave me the habit of looking up before deciding down. I gave him the habit of naming feelings before they announced themselves as mistakes. Our usefulness kept pace with our thirst. We found the mouth of a dry wash freckled with wolf tracks and last week's lightning strikes. He lifted his palm to test the wind's politics, eyes closing as if listening to gossip he would never repeat. The cry came again, closer, and then the desert swallowed it to see what we would do without prodding. Now or not at all, he said, and the words sorted courage from appetite. If we moved, we could be covered by storm or carried off by it. If we waited, the flanks might meet on our backs. He looked at the knot on my wrist, the promise not to drop myself, and tightened it. One notch for weather. He showed me the line he wanted, a slant that threaded high ground just long enough to keep the arroyo in our peripheral vision, then dipped to a boulder garden where tracks break into nonsense. We move like we belong, he said, or the land will tell on us. I took one breath for the person I had been in the yard, one for the person I was trying to be on the road, and one for the child I had not yet promised but already refused to lose to men who count women by coins. Then I nodded. Thunder ticked 1, 2, 5, far enough to be teacher, near enough to be law. The first fat drops darkened dust in a Morse code only the horse seemed to read. He raised his palm to the wind a second time, felt the shift, and gave the verdict that would either save us or scorch us into lesson, now, or we don't get another. We drew them into a corral. The land had already made, basalt walls shouldered into a circle, a mouth that swallowed orders and spat them back as echo, a floor of dust that rose in sheets and blinded certainty. He'd shown me the notch where sound ricochets. I climbed there with the bow and the oath I'd practiced under my breath. The hunter ghosted the rim, setting stones that would tip and speak when hooves pushed too close. We did not seal an ambush. We prepared a boundary and invited men to bruise themselves on it. Stop horses, not hearts, I told my hands as the first riders funneled in, their shouts fraying in the echo until the lieutenants couldn't tell their own commands from fear. I loosed low and in front, an arrow kissing sand at a foreleg so the animal checked itself and the man checked his aim. Another flicked a pistol from a hand that loved itself too much. A third snapped against a bridle ring and turned speed into doubt. No new widows would be minted for my freedom. Justice without spectacle, honor by restraint. Through the dust, one rider broke my older brother, hat low, mouth chewed thin. Shame gathered in his eyes the way water gathers in a hoof print after rain. He reached for a word as if language were a rope with knots he'd forgotten how to use. I did not give him the play he wanted. "Here are the terms," I said, voice thrown clean by the rock. "You don't name me. You don't touch me. You don't sell our mother's teaching to men with ledgers. If you want to leave this square with your skin unbit, you stand down and you stand back." He looked at the ground like a boy who had broken a bowl the house needed. He backed his horse 2 steps, and the corral exhaled once. The buyer arrived then, paper in fist like a blade sharpened with ink. He cut through men who had lost their certainty and waved the document as if law were a wind he could summon. Contract, he barked. Debt. Transfer. He didn't look at me so much as at the space where my worth had once been written small enough to fold. The crowd leaned. A performance was the price of their attention. I offered a statement instead. Your paper tells only the part that pays you. Mine tells breath. I pulled from my bodice the letter of truth, the one that smells of nights I refused to let the child in my arms starve, and I held it high enough for the sun to witness. He laughed the clipped laugh of men who want to get to the part where someone cries. That's not ledger, he said. That's sentiment. Dust haloed his hat like a bad saint's. The echo doubled my answer. This is testimony. I let his paper touch mine. I tore his first clean through the sum that mistook me for a column. Then I tore the copy of my own, not to erase it, but to end its use as proof for people who had never bled for me, and I said what no yard wants to hear. I am not for sale. The corral went quiet the way a church does when a child speaks loud truth. You could feel the crowd searching for a barrack, cue riot or revival, while my spine decided which future it could carry. A hat's brim cut the dust at the mouth of the bowl, lawman's silhouette stamped into glare. The sheriff's horse stepped down like a gavel. He took in the torn paper, the bent guns, my bow, and he said nothing. His hand went to the brim, as if to lift it or lower it, and the square held its breath for the sentence he'd make of us. Daylight takes away excuses. I stood where everyone could see me, no whisper verdicts, no backroom pity, and I said my own name first so no one else could use it to buy or sell me. I stole bread, I said. I lied to shield a child. The ledger says debt. The truth says hunger. You can hang a hunger if it makes you feel clean, but it won't feed a house. The hunter stood at my back like spine, not shield, letting me command the square I had built out of echo and restraint. The sheriff listened the way old timber listens to a storm, calculating what it can hold. I did not wait for his arithmetic. Your law counts coins, I said. Mine counts breath. Today I count mine out loud. I lifted the torn halves of the buyer's paper so the crowd could see what they wanted me to kneel to. This buys nothing that matters, I said, and let the pieces fall. From the rim, a cane tapped stone, a small, steady punctuation. The midwife stepped forward, bonnet crooked, eyes that had seen too many rooms where breath leaves. I saw this woman beg doors for bread when her husband swung. She said, I saw your cupboards shut. Ledger won't tell you that, so I will. A few townspeople, faces I knew by habit more than name, left the comfort of the crowd and stood where their spines could be counted. Conscience is quiet until someone holds a bowl for it. The buyer spat. Theft. The sheriff lifted one hand and the word went dumb. I'm not the rope today, he said, voice round as a boot print. Banishment stands. He looked at me and did not blink. You cross the line and don't cross back. It was power trying to call itself mercy. I would not let it rename my decision. I accept survival, I said, on terms I set. My terms were simple, and I made them public so they couldn't be switched after sundown. No coordinates to my door, no claims on my body, and no right to my name in any mouth I don't feed. Our ethic went on to the air in words even dust could carry, guardianship over spectacle, restraint over theater, witness over rumor. The crowd, unpracticed at quiet justice, twitched for entertainment. A rifle lifted at the edge like a bad habit coming back after a good week. You could feel the old economy of pain asking for a deposit. I opened my mouth to say not today and never, when the hunter moved with the efficiency of a man who doesn't audition for savior. He stepped into the line between the barrel's blink and my chest, shoulders squared to make choice easier for the shooter. The shot cracked the bowl like a bell. He flinched and kept his feet grazed, not fallen blood bright as a signature across his shirt. Cost made visible. Courage written where cowards could read it. Something shifted then that you can't plot on paper. Men who had arrived to see a hanging blinked as if smoke stung their eyes. The sheriff's hand left his brim and touched the holster instead, not to draw, but to remind the crowd what order refuses to be today. He turned his horse, angling the animal so my path out would exist. "Lines west," he said, not asking me to thank him. Now, I stepped forward with my letter of truth folded small, the midwife's cane tapping time, the hunter's blood cooling into a vow none of us had spoken. "We are not a show," I said, for the last time anyone in that square would hear my voice. "We are leaving." As the crowd parted, the sheriff's deputy hissed, "You'll be back for hunger." I looked at the edge of the town where the road unbuttoned into heat and said to no one in particular, "Hunger is invited where honor is not." Then we walked toward the line the law had drawn, carrying a ledger only breath could settle. He waited until the valley exhaled, until the dust of the reversed square settled back into its ordinary grammar, and only then did he offer the door that other men mistake for a trophy. He said his Diné name the way water says itself when no one is listening, low, exact, with a weight that has already carried winters, and he said it for me alone. Not for the crowd we had unbuilt, not for any ledger that might try to spell him into property, not for a memory greedy for proof. I did not repeat it. I held it the way you hold a coal meant to start a fire somewhere safer, letting it warm a place I had long kept cold. Off camera, off page, off the mouths of people who take syllables the way they take land. That was my craft now. Respect turned from posture into practice. We walked the rim of the corral we had invented until the echo forgot our footsteps, and we spoke aloud the difference I needed if I was going to survive the pull of spectacle public teaching versus private keeping, behavior over rights, boundaries that build and not just bar. We would model restraint in plain daylight where men could pretend not to understand, and we would refuse to dress sacred work in the kind of language buyers rent to flatter themselves. If the square demanded a performance, we would offer statements. If the road demanded obedience to old harm, we would offer consent lines and keep them whether anyone clapped or cursed. At the edge of the trail, I took out the coin, the one that had burned in my pocket like a cold star. Even while the sheriff's horse parted the mob and I let my palm remember the exact weight of what my brothers had chosen, it could anchor a letter to a table so wind could not bully it. It could buy bread for other women the town preferred to starve. It could be nailed into pine at the post where buyers pass, an iron warning hammered where their eyes have to look. I stated my choice aloud because naming is a lever, and levers move more than confession does. "We will spend it on bread that leaves no ledger," I said. "We will feed 2 houses the yard has already priced." He nodded once, approval without ownership, while I tucked the decision into the part of me that has vowed not to rehearse shame for men who sell it. He unslung the broken saddle pieces, laying them on the ground like a map of the person he refuses to be again. Fender to the east, the miles he rode when speed mistook itself for virtue. Skirt to the west, the comfort cut away when mercy needed leather more than pride did. Billets braided north-south, a reminder that strength is a thing you build in strands, not a single strip that will snap when weather insists. He traced the shape with one finger and said nothing that sounded like a lesson, only breathed as if the new pattern already knew how to carry us. I understood then that repentance rarely asks for forgiveness first. It asks for scissors. We set the rules of our telling the same way we'd set the corral, simply, precisely, with stones placed where they would speak before we had to. Consent lines. He decides what his name does for other mouths. I decide what mine does not do for ledgers. No coordinates in any story we give to strangers. No rights described for the hungry. No rumor dignified with proof that costs a woman her sleep. If we must argue, we argue about behavior, not about ownership. If we must refuse, we refuse without humiliation, because honor lives or dies in the tone of a no. Down the trail, a riderless wind brought paper with it, or so it felt, the sudden presence of a letter where only dust had been a moment before. It lay against a stone with the quiet of a thing that knows it can hurt without raising its voice. The seal was the trader's, crude wax pressed flat by the weight of a thumb that has found profit where other men find prayer. But the scrawl at the edge, just a nick of ink escaping the fold, was my brother's script, the way they used to sign their names on fence slats to claim a chore as done. The hunter watched my face and did not reach. I recognized both marks with the kind of dread that comes braided. Apology and trap, olive branch and snare, the past pretending it has learned to knock. I did not open it. Paper can ambush as surely as men can. I held the fold shut with my thumb and let the coin's absence speak where the weight used to be. A name is a door, I said, echoing the truth he had trusted me to carry. And so is this. He tilted his head, listening to what I did not need to say. The past knocks, I added, the letter warming against my palm. We choose the handle. Behind us, the square we built out of restraint was already dissolving back into unremarkable rock. Before us, the road insisted we pick which stories could walk beside us without biting. A smear of flour at the flap's edge, trader's counter dust, not home. My brothers had not sealed it themselves. They had let the man who profits from shame do the pressing. That truth tightened something in my chest that forgiveness cannot untie quickly. I slipped the letter into the sling beside the thread and the last of the saddle leather, unopened, and said to the man who had given me his name as duty and not as gift, "We'll answer when we can pay in breath, not in performance." He touched 2 fingers to the broken map of tack and turned toward the ridge where the county line thinned into heat. We stepped together, the letter heavy as a choice I would not let anyone else make for me. The road out of a spectacle rarely looks like victory. It looks like work. We walked west until the air cooled enough to remember manners, and then we turned toward an outpost I had once heard named in a spare voice, a place where trade is taught without bodies on the counter, where clinics stitch more than skin, where widows learn to price their labor without discounting their breath. We did not ride in as rescued people. We walked in as apprentices to a future we intended to keep. The first lesson nailed to the wall in that long, low room said it plain. We refuse spectacle not because we fear the gaze, but because what we tend will die of exposure. I set my letter of truth on a table that had been cleaned so often it had learned the shine of usefulness, and I asked what work was needed that I could learn quickly without breaking any more women than a town already had. They showed me ledgers that count daylight, not shame names of who brings what to market, who needs thread or water or a pair of hands to lift a loom, and I taught myself to copy straight and to ask before I wrote what a person wished to be called. Public teaching happens in such rooms, under such light. How to say no with your chin up, how to barter with labor first, how to keep your dignity when men try to buy it wholesale. Private keeping happens in the silence that follows a woman's first honest inventory of what she can no longer sell without disappearing. The hunter came and went like weather you can trust, arriving when word carried teeth, leaving when the desert called him back into the grammar of wind and rock. The bow he had handed me the day the corral turned from yard to courtroom lay across the rafters that first night, a question I had to answer alone. Legacy is not an inheritance. It is a choice you endorse in public. I climbed the ladder and brought it down. If I keep it, I told myself, I carry the ethic that loosed only to stop, that drew only to protect. If I return it, the ethic stays in the world anyway, and in my hands that now know restraint is accuracy and accuracy is mercy. In the morning I placed the bow across his saddle where it could find the road with him, and I kept the wrist strap he'd tied the promise, knot that tightens under panic and loosens under breath. The weapon belonged to his journey. The ethic would belong to mine. By noon the letter had learned the heat of the room and stopped trying to seize my pulse. If it held apology, I would define forgiveness with boundaries, because forgiveness without a door and a lock is only fatigue dressed up as virtue. If it held a threat, I would define response without spectacle, because I will not make a stage out of the very harm I refuse to sell. I opened it with a knife that has cut meat and rope and never once opened a person. The paper stank of the trader's hands. The words inside leaned toward the handwriting I had learned at our mother's table. They were careful and not brave. They asked whether I would accept money in place of truth, whether I would accept a different coin in place of the one already spent on bread for other mouths, whether I would consider coming back for the winter so the town could learn to forgive itself by watching me pretend to be grateful. I wrote my answer on the same table, where women had priced flour and fiber and hours of their backs. I did not rehearse sorrow for an audience that had not earned tears. You can come where boundaries live, I wrote, or you can stay with the man whose thumb weighs your sentences. You do not buy your way back into a family with coins. You build your way back with labor and listening and the long truth told without witnesses. I am not the proof you need to become different men. If you wish to be different, build bridges, not buyers. I folded the page around a ribbon the color of that shop toy's imagined tail and sent it by a courier who understood the difference between message and leverage. The outpost took the ethic we brought and made it public in ways that choke rumor. We drafted rules. No coordinates to a woman's door. No rights named for men who want content. No gossip sold as warnings. No ledgers that count bodies. Trade in labor, not in flesh. Teach refusal without humiliation. Accept banishment when it keeps you breathing. Refuse exile that calls itself rescue. I stitched the rules on a cloth that hangs where newcomers put down their fear, and I learned again that law written in ink is only as strong as the hands that lift it when it's time to say no. Some nights I stood at the edge of the clinic yard, where the wind braided itself through the posts, and I practiced the discipline of not performing my survival for anyone. Faces unfilmed, futures unperformed, that was our quiet vow. Spoken while we shelled beans or unrolled bandages or rewove the straps of a pack a woman had carried longer than any man had carried her. The hunter's shadow would sometimes cut the far fence line, a reminder that guardianship is movement as often as it is standing still. He did not ask for thanks. He did not collect witnesses. He took the bow and kept walking. If the letter came again, it came clean. One brother's hand brought it. He did not cross the threshold. He asked permission with his hat in his fingers, a choreography we had agreed on by mail. He said hunger without asking me to forgive him for using the word. He offered labor, not promise, not plan. 3 days stacking, 2 digging, 1 teaching the boys in the yard the knot that keeps a body from dropping itself when fear sells a story. I accepted that ledger because it spends where I need it to. Forgiveness sat in the shade and took its time. As for the sheriff and his line, we walked it without ceremony, because spectacle would have pretended he gave us mercy instead of jurisdiction. The county turned to red clay underfoot, and then to something greener that remembered rain. People did not lean out of doors to judge our backs. They kept sewing, hauling, teaching their children to stop when a woman says stop. The line meant less there, because honor does not require borders. It requires work. On the last morning we slept within sight of that fence and of weathered posts. Dawn ran a small experiment with us. A coin sat on the top rail, glinting where only a deliberate hand could have placed it. donation or threat, alms or bait. I did not touch it. Gifts that require public gratitude cost too much. Lures that flatter your luck cost more. I waited until the hunter stood beside me. He lifted it with 2 fingers and set it in the palm of my hand without comment, a question shaped like metal. I closed my fingers, felt the cool circle argue with the heat of my skin, and decided in front of him and the day. We would buy flour for the women who arrive late, after doorways have closed. We would make the purchase without names and call it even with no one. We would nail nothing to any post, because warnings made of coins teach boys to worship the wrong god. We would train the new hands on knots and breath and the arithmetic of refusal. We would keep the bow's ethic and stop pretending salvation wears a brim. The auction had not left me, but it had learned its right size. It would not set my price again. I put the coin in a jar where bread waits for mouths, and folded the letter of truth around the inside like a lining so the sound of giving would not echo like chains. Then I turned to the door, where the day stood without judgment, and I let the hinge sing. I closed my hand on the letter and opened the door to the day. I said, to the room, to the road, to the version of myself that had run for so long she forgot. Arriving is also a verb. Outside, clouds built work above us. Inside, we had already begun.